Hello YouTube and welcome to the second episode of our series on a map development for ARK Survival Evolved. In this episode we will talk about painting and shaping the landscape which we created in the last episode. The first thing that we're going to want to do is come up here to our landscape tool. We're going to paint the map into a shade that we can see. So in order to do that, the ARK development kit has some really cool things already built in. So if we scroll down here a little bit, we'll see all of these materials, the target layers, and they all have nothing assigned as the current asset for that, but they each have suggested fill-ins, landscape layers. And we're just going to assign the first one of each of those to whichever ones we want to use. Now I'm going to use this grass texture to fill out the map just so we can see it while we're doing some of the sculpting on the map. If you remember last week, we created a map on Photoshop, and while this isn't a perfect square, we're just going to pull in this island just a little bit so that it matches a perfect square, and we're going to create this map on this square in the ARK development kit. This is going to allow us to start creating things like biomes and things of that nature, but for this episode we're going to be focused primarily on sculpting and coloring of the landscape. I won't show everything, but I will show enough to get you started if you plan on following along. So with that in mind, I should give a fair warning that this is a extremely large map. I mentioned it last time. So we'll see quite a bit of lag as we paint, so nothing to be worried about. It's just the nature of the beast. Here's a bit of a lag out. It doesn't really matter. We're going to paint over all of this with the desired texture for each zone. But for right now, I just want to be able to see it as opposed to this dark color that is required for the landscape material. So as we paint over it, I'm going to rotate it slightly so it's more straight on. We know that this map that we're working on has 4 main islands, maybe a 5th smaller island, and then a few tiny islands scattered around in the ocean around it. So the first thing we're going to do when we end up sculpting is create Alright, now that that's all painted, I want to make sure that everybody is on the same page. If you followed along last time, there's a few things up in this top right corner that you don't already have. You don't have to worry about this second landscape. That was just me testing something out. We added a directional camera and a really important thing called a global post-processing blueprint, which actually doesn't show up there, it shows up here. If we go up to our standard place class and we type in global post-processing blueprint, you just click and drag it into the scene. This is how ARK renders the scene. I also added this point light, but that doesn't matter. I also added a player start and a camera actor. Camera actor shows nothing right now, it's just a camera. It has to be there for the global post-processing blueprint. Once you hit play, and we won't do that this episode, but once you do, that camera will be attached to the ARK player. So specifically related to our landscape, we're going to do a little bit of sculpting now. We're going to raise up the ground where we have a few islands planned. On this map, we have a few mountain ranges and a few areas where it's going to be high and a good amount of water. So the first thing that I recommend doing is pulling up the mountain ranges all the way to the max, just so you're aware of the height restrictions of the map. So in the center of our map, we are going to have a volcano. And I'm just going to raise it all the way to the max initially. Let's do this. Raise it all the way to the max height, so you can see that it plateaus out here. And ignore the lines, that's just the editor rendering the material of the ground in. This volcano is the max height of our map under its current configuration, which is a scale of 100 by 100 by 180. This is a similar scale that the island uses on its development. So what we want to do is actually have our volcano be a tiny bit lower than that. We don't want to have it at our max because it's flat at the max. I can't raise it any further. I can just sort of expand that top outcropping. So what I'm going to do is hold down Shift, click, and that actually lowers it a little bit. And you can see I can change the height so it's, not flat and all that jazz. That won't be our final volcano, but it's just a location to get the idea in place. So we'll also work on our island that's off to the right. We're just going to pull this up a little bit. It's worth noting that we can change our brush size, fall off, and strength. For right now, that doesn't really matter. We're just getting a basic idea, so we'll handle that as we come to deal with it later. You'll notice that there is some significant lag even on simple things like raising and creating landscapes. If you find that your landscape is not a suitable resolution, you've potentially missed a setup in the landscape creation. So if we come to manage here, we got a selection tool, we can hit new landscape. I'm not going to create one, but all you really need to do is where it says the number of components or the overall resolution. This is the amount of detail on the height map that is associated with the level that you are creating. 8,000 by 8,000 is like pretty much the max that a computer can render. 4,000 by 4,000 I think is the size of the center. So I have a 127 by 127 quad that's 4,000 by 4,000. So this map should be on par with the center in terms of size. Just keep that in mind if you find that you don't have enough resolution on your map or there's not enough detail. So I'm going to continue, wrong mode. I'm going to continue hashing out this eastern island. It doesn't have to be precise at this stage. We're just trying to get it to a point where it makes sense and fits along with the image that we had in our mind at the start of the map. If we hold down Shift, we can make stuff go down. This will be the largest island on the map, so having it properly sketched out to a semi-viable state is important. So you notice that we can, in Unreal, unlike Unity's terrain system, dip down below the map. That's perfectly fine. Just be aware that when you're underneath the map, you can't go look up through it. And that will be important once we develop caves and other things in the map. but there are ways around it, and we'll discuss that when we get there. So that looks like a fine start for that island. We need to develop the island that's on the top of the map, right up here. What we'll likely do on the back side of this island, rather than having some ocean or something of the sort, what we'll do on this back side of this island is have a cliff that goes along the back, much like the southern border of the center, or something of the sort. Let's see how that looks vertically. Probably need to add some height to all this. There are several tools that we can use in the landscape toolkit. We'll discuss that shortly here. Primarily the three that you'll be using are smooth, flatten, and sculpt. Flatten can be particularly useful when you're creating something and you know what height that it needs to be, say our volcano or something like that, and you want everything else to be that height. So at the top of the volcano, we know we want it to be flat. We can use our flatten tool, and it brings everything up to the level of that height. That's pretty useful. Not so useful on our top island here, but it is useful at times. And smooth will actually take the difference of your highs and lows and average them all out across a gradient. So when we have something like a shoreline on an island that we're trying to create, we haven't created our oceans yet, but when we have a shoreline, we need to make sure that the player can walk up that shoreline. It's not a situation where they get stuck in the water and there's no way out. So we can use smooth to make sure that that's a nice gentle slope up onto the island, as opposed to a much larger and difficult cliff to climb. So I went ahead and finished the rest of the general mark out of where I want some of the islands to be on this map. You'll know from this picture these aren't all of the islands, but it does give me a general idea of where I want things to be on this map. And this is a pretty large map, so I don't need everything to be perfect right away. If I want to add an island here, I can do that. Island. I will, on off screen, go through and make some of the oceans, but it's a fairly similar process where instead of just clicking to raise up, we're using shift to lower. And like I said earlier, we can go below the ocean, below the level of the landscape, and that's going to be particularly useful for the ocean. So we're below the level of the starting landscape. This is the level of the starting landscape right here, and we can go below that, and that's what we're going to do to map out where some of the stuff in the oceans are. The only other thing that I really wanted to discuss on this episode was how to do some of the texturing and some tips and tricks for that. So we'll swap over to the paint module here, and we'll go down to some of the other layer info layers. Here I have selected wet sand, and that's going to be something that we're going to put in the ocean. So I'll come down here to where I know there's going to be an ocean. It's between this island, the volcano island, and another island, but I know that there is an ocean in this area. And you'll notice that up here I have the tool strength somewhere around 0.2. We can bump that up if we want to. Say we want to put it at 0.3, but if I click, right away nothing happens. But if I click and drag and move around a little bit, you start to see it start to come through. Now wet sand's a little bit annoying because it starts to reflect the sunlight due to the global post-processing blueprint, but we just need to not be staring at an adjacent angle of the directional light. So as we click and drag, this becomes more and more prevalent. This is based on the tool strength that we do. If we swap this to 100%, this is a lot faster. we don't necessarily want it at 100% because there are going to be times where we're meshing between where two areas are meeting. So let's say up here where this is land, we have some beach sand, right? We're putting our beach sand in here. And we know that wet sand is coming up to meet it. So we have this wet sand here. You'll notice that they're two different materials, but we want them to intersect nicely. If we have our tool strength at less than 1, we can make sure that there is some moderate overlap. So as you can see, it's not a straight line. There's little jagged edges where one part is higher than another, and this is really just a method that people use to make sure that the layers blend nicely together. So we have our wet sand, and it's down here. That's perfectly fine. It's underneath the water right there. But right here at the beach, we want the wet sand to meet the dry sand right where the water ends. And the way that we do that is by not using 100% strength on our tools. So off screen, I will go through and paint a lot of this level. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking, commenting, subscribing, all that jazz. And we'll see you next week.